introduction and for this invitation. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, Fernando, we are recording this session for the benefit of one of the students that couldn't be here. So if you don't mind, and the rest of the students, please allow me to record this.
Excellent, excellent. Well, again, thank you all for this invitation. My understanding is that we want to talk about a little bit about the work that I've been doing with the Union of Concerned Scientists and science engagement and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I'll talk a little bit about how I ended up doing that kind of work, and then I'll show a little bit of what we have in store. First, I'll say that I went to school to try to understand how social movements could change policies. The reason I did that was because I was myself a part of these movements, and I really cut my teeth in terms of organizing down in Puerto Rico, where both Marla and I are from. And there I became very active in the pro-independence movement as well as the student movement. Among other issues, I was active in environmental organizing. So I was kind of really interested in all these progressive issues. I was interested in anti-militarism. In Puerto Rico, you could not avoid any of these things, honestly. So they all piqued my interest. I became a part of the student movement, very involved. And as I was in the middle of an occupation that lasted 62 days of our campus of the University of Puerto Rico, I kept asking myself constantly. At that time, I thought I want to study political theory, and I still did. I still do. I love political theory. But beyond theory, I really wanted to get an understanding about, how do we make sure we change policies? And, of course, people have all kinds of theories about policies, about how policies change. One of which is through the agency of people, right? As Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without demand, right? Policies don't change for the better out of any sort of vacuum. Social movements and people organizing are some of the most important vectors and drivers of social change. In fact, the greatest social changes, right? The formation of the modern nation state as we know it. We have scholars who have argued this was because of agency, because people organized to form these movements. Scholars like Theda Skocpol, for instance, in a wonderful book, States and Social Revolutions. Other scholars have argued the major social policies, the gender revolutions that we are witnessing in places like Europe, or the major campaigns against apartheid in South Africa. The civil rights movement. All of these have been major forces of change. I want to understand how to affect change. So that's why I went to the United States from Puerto Rico and tried to get a PhD under the supervision of someone who had just written a book, When Movements Make Policy. And I said, all right, this is the right place, the right time. That's what I started studying. I did that for my PhD, and then I went out for a job, only to find out that getting a job as a political scientist, particularly one who's interested in movements and questions that affect people of color, was not the easiest thing to do. But I was very fortunate, and I did a postdoc with the Scholar Strategy Network, which is a network that is devoted to connecting scholars with policymakers and organizers, and to try to make sure that the things that we do in academia and higher education help us inform the work that we do on the ground in the real world, in policy as well as in organizing. So I spent I spent 2 years living in St. Louis, Missouri, and doing that almost all of my time, connecting scholars with policymakers and with organizers, and then becoming myself involved in all kinds of organizing efforts back there in St. Louis. I did a participant observation of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is a movement that I've been very interested in, and I'm sure that all of you are very aware of that movement. It's unavoidable in the place that you live, or anywhere really, because it's now one of the largest movements that we've ever witnessed in history. And I was involved in efforts to try to avoid gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, racial gerrymandering, drawing districts in ways that favor a particular party or suppress the vote of of non-whites, and I became involved in all kinds of campaigns there in St. Louis. I then again had to go try to get a job again, right? Because it was only a postdoctoral fellowship. At that time, I applied for like 250 jobs. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but when you apply for an academic job, it is not easy. You are submitting like 7 different documents, all of which are tailored to the place you're applying to if you really want a shot. And I did that for about 200 something places. So I produced more than 1,000 documents, all the while trying to maintain a research agenda and trying to keep up with my organizing. Let me just say 2017, 2018, 2019 were exhausting years for me. I'm still exhausted, but these experiences really open up some opportunities, particularly as I was looking for jobs. I saw that the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is really one of the largest organizations of scientists, was looking for a social scientist who, or actually they even said they were looking for a political scientist who studied social movements and issues of diversity. And I said to myself, that's me. That's me. I don't know anyone else who could fit that description. Look, they found someone else. And I was like, okay. I thought I was going to land that thing. They interviewed me, nothing. So I end up landing 2 other gigs and I accept them both at the same time. They agreed to let me do both at the same time. And apparently whoever Union of Concerned Scientists had hired was like, sorry, I found a better job. And then they came back to me and they were like, hey, do you want to take our job? I said, well, thank you, but no thanks, because I already landed my jobs and I'm good. I have like a solid job. I don't need to go back out in the market after I finish a fellowship with you. And fellowships can be very exhausting. Your employer can be, they can take everything from you. They have large expectations of what they're going to get out of a postdoc because they say, oh, this person has some training already, some experience. So these fellowships can be really exhausting. I was like, you know what? I'm willing to do it if we do it as a grant. So we did it as a grant. They agreed to that. That's how I came to work with the Union of Concerned Scientists. The purpose of this project has been to try to understand the circumstances under which science advocacy becomes diversified and politically impactful. Why do they care about this? Well, if you look at the history of science advocacy, you'll notice that science advocacy is a predominantly white industry. If we consider it, or sector, it's mostly made up of now retired senior white male academics. And it's just merely a reflection of what higher education looks like. So that's who they organize, right? And they started, Union of Concerned Scientists drew a lot of its organizing energies from anti-nuclear campaigns. That's how this union or organization came to be, and it drew support from very well-known scholars throughout the world, including Nobel Prize winners who were all against nuclear weapons, the siting of nuclear energy facilities in areas where they might put lower income and minority populations at risk, and things of that nature. So they began growing, and they became what is now known as a checkbook organization, which is, of course, probably no longer relevant because we now pay through PayPal or Visa. But in the past, members of civic organizations used to just write a check every month. And this is what made organizations like Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Union of Concerned Scientists, huge Sierra Club, huge well-funded organizations that have a yearly revenue of more than $10 million. So they're running organizations that have more than 200 people on staff year after year, and the bulk of their money is coming from member donations. This is why they're known as checkbook organization. Fascinating history. We can go more into that, but this is how this organization becomes so strong. But, fast forward to 2020, they look at themselves in the mirror, and, they realize that they're not necessarily the most representative organization of what is now becoming the professorate, right? This population that they're trying to mobilize. And, what kind of legitimacy are they really going to have when they try to go to these conferences and, the people who are they trying to speak to look more like this Zoom room than their conference room, right? So they said, okay, we need to do something about this. Well, they're all about evidence-based work, right? They're scientists, but they didn't have social scientists in their ranks. So the people who could provide the evidence to diversify and to strengthen the advocacy of this organization were just not involved in this organization. They did not have access to that evidence. So that's why they started investing in looking for social scientists. That's why, I convene a working group of experts on social movements, experts on science advocacy, experts on environmental justice, among other issues of minorities in science and STEM. And we got together, your Professor Marla included in this group, among others, and we are now kind of like a brain trust. We pull together all of the knowledge that we know from our previous work, from the literature, and then we're also doing new research because this is a really under-examined area of research and an under-examined population. There isn't much research out there on the political activism of scientists. And I encourage you all to go to Google Scholar and search it. You're not going to find much. So here we are trying to learn from what other movements do, the little that is known about science advocacy, and then trying to move our knowledge about this forward. That's the kind of work that I'm doing. And now that you know what I'm doing, I want to show you a little bit of what we've been up to. Let me just say that it's been a lot of fun. Again, exhausting stuff because we're juggling. Everybody's juggling. I convened this group. Like, people got the letters of invitation mid-March. Guess what else happened mid-March? Shutdowns. Like, for the foreseeable future, people just didn't see like any sort of path out of this. Like, we still wonder how we're going to get out of this pandemic. Then, an uprising blows up in your city. And again, like, the world seems to be crumbling. We're in the middle of a climate emergency, a public health emergency, a crisis of race relations. And I'm trying to tell these folks, hey, your work that you're doing with us during these circumstances matters. And look, part of me is part of that pitch for them to join was purely based on my personal belief that it matters. But at the time, I had my own doubts. Sometimes I still do. And I think that in part, it's not about this. It's not about whether our work as social scientists and scholars matters. It's about us making it matter. And I think that's why it's good to be surrounded by folks who understand that research evidence isn't adopted in policy and organizing by some kind of magic or miracle. No, it takes relationship building. It takes communications. It takes people who take that evidence, make it intelligible to the public, and then spread it and work with those who will make sure that that evidence becomes policy or is used to create policy and to guide organizing efforts. It's not easy. It's what I've been doing for the last 3 years. I can tell you right now, it's not easy, but it is possible. And there are great examples of folks doing so. Let me share my screen so you all can see what we've been up to. But as I'm sharing my screen, if anyone wants to jump in and ask me any questions about what I've just said, I'm happy to entertain them, and then we can talk about some of the research that I've been doing with the working group. So please feel free to jump in, ask me questions while I'm figuring out screen sharing in Zoom. Any questions?
Oh, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I'm definitely working towards more of the science side of things, like working in a lab and that. But like you said that, and you like definitely work with a lot of scientists. What's something that you've seen that like scientists, like the people who are doing the research and the scientific data can do better, I guess, to aid political scientists and like, yeah.
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. And my response is that I wouldn't put the whole burden of doing this work on those who are not political scientists. And the reason is the following. Look, all fields are responsible for crossing their disciplinary boundaries. Like, I don't think that we political scientists or sociologists should sit back and wait for our colleagues across campus to, come to our seminars. I think we should intentionally, particularly us political science and sociologists who know that relationships matter, we should be going and, stretching our hand and offering to collaborate. I certainly been doing that. And I know Marla and Cecilio in Puerto Rico have been doing that. And you know what? It's been a beautiful and wonderful thing to observe, because we now, when we combine our different areas of expertise, the kind of research that we can do is so much more powerful. So I think relationship building is key, and distributing that burden of building relationships. No one should be expected to put more or less into that. I will do say that based on, some of the research that I've done, which you've all heard about, I do think that we should follow the leadership of marginalized scientists, of marginalized from underrepresented groups, from marginalized groups, particularly from intersectionally marginalized groups. They have been historically excluded from academia as well as from this kind of work, even though they bring fantastic insight, important insight. And I think that we ignore that insight at our own peril. So I do think that there is a larger share of responsibility on those who do not identify as being from a historically underrepresented group in academia, to knock on doors, to say, hey, your work matters and I'm here to support it, as opposed to just going and doing it by themselves, ignoring, excluding those who have been historically excluded.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you. Great question. Other questions? Anyone else want to jump in?
I think we can continue, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lively discussion after you finish.
All right. Again, please feel free to jump in at any point. This is not a formal presentation. I wouldn't have worn my Puerto Rican man on the moon shirt if I felt it was that formal. Happy to entertain questions as we're speaking. Also, can you all see my slides? Yes. All right. Okay. Well, I love my slides. I always put time into making them pretty. I did not have as much time as I would have liked to have. So they're very text heavy. So I'm going to apologize in advance for that. It's a sin from someone who is himself calling for better science communications to have crafted a PowerPoint slide like this. Part of the reason is that this is really new research, and we're still sort of working with the data. So you are all getting something that hasn't even been published. There's some stuff that we've put out, but it's still under review. So you're getting really some fresh research. It's part of the reason for why it doesn't look pretty. I will make it pretty in the future. Hopefully you all get to see later iterations of this. All right, so like I said, this is the work of a working group, which is in itself a fascinating experience. You know, we're about 12 scholars from different parts of the world, from different backgrounds, different identities, different disciplines, all of which come together with an interest in diversifying and strengthening science advocacy. And we've agreed on doing a series of different projects and research related projects. This is one of the first ones we're putting out in the world. So we surveyed, the Union of Concerned Scientists has a network. It's called the Science Network. It's made up of about 19,000 scientists who have joined this network because they want to become more involved. They don't just want to write the checks at the end of the month. They want organizers within within the Union of Concerned Scientists to tell them, this is something you could do to contribute to our organizing. So these are folks who are already engaged and who are thirsty for more engagement. A really cool group of folks to try to understand, given those interests, right? So one of the first things we did was convene this working group. You all know how we did that. We reviewed the little research that there is out there on this topic. We then did a little bit of rapid response work. So because the world was crumbling and we needed to do something, right? We can't just, sit back in our Zoom university and just, continue doing our research as if nothing is happening, or as if we don't have anything to say about the pandemic, how scientists can become active in trying to get science used for trying to address the pandemic, in the many ways in which science needs to be used to try to mitigate the effects of the pandemic. We also did some work around the Black Lives Matter uprising. We talked a little bit about why scientists are going through their own reckoning with race because of the problematic history of science with race. So we published some blog posts, we did some webinars and things of that nature. All the while we were designing and collecting data. So this network of 19,000 scientists, we wanted to survey them. Why? Because these are folks who can mobilize if and when needed, and we don't know much about them. Or at least we didn't know what we didn't know. So it was kind of like a black box. So we wanted to survey them, ask them a bunch of questions. That was part of the issue. When you have all these burning questions, 12 people in a working group, all of which have interesting questions, and you have to design a survey, we had to find a way of making this survey short enough for people to be willing to take it. It was not easy. And I did get angry emails from respondents saying, I took your survey, but it's too long. I'm like, well, thank you. But that happened, and these are scientists and they hold themselves in very high esteem. Some of them are survey researchers. So they see this survey and they're like, this isn't perfect and you should know better because you are the Union of Concerned Scientists. And you know what? I oftentimes just told them, you are right. And thank you for that feedback. We have a spreadsheet of all the feedback. It wasn't that much, but we're incorporating it. And I think that's part of the process of doing good research, is being ready to entertain criticism with, grace, some of which is not shown to you by those who criticize it. But we launched our survey. We were thinking, how are we going to survey enough people to be able to make claims about this population? We brainstormed. Well, one solution was that every year, the Union of Concerned Scientists goes to all these different academic conferences and distributes calendars. This year, there's no conference to go to. So I was like, well, why don't we send the calendars to survey respondents as a thank you and as an incentive for them to respond? We needed a good response rate to be able to say with some confidence that what we are observing through the survey is somewhat representative of the overall population of 19,000 scientists. We ended up tweaking a little bit of the numbers and decided to come down to about 16,000 because there were about 3,000 who couldn't really be considered members per se. They were kind of on edge. There was no way we're going to reach those folks. So we brought it down to 16,000. Out of 16,000, we were hoping to get about a 15% response rate. We knew it wasn't going to be possible because they survey this population every year and they only get about 5% response rate. But 5% response rate was not good enough for us to have confidence in what we were saying about this population and those things being representative of the overall population. So we were aspiring to at least 8, 9, 10. We landed at 9%. Not terrible. Definitely will withstand peer review, but still there will be questions raised about the extent to which this is in fact representative of the population. And there are things that we can do later on to try to make sure that we are in fact doing a good job of representing this population. One of which is that we are using membership data to try to apply weights to our survey so that we weigh a little more the responses of those who we may have underrepresented in our sampling. If this sounds complicated, please ask me questions. A few months ago, before I started getting involved in this, I would have been very confused because I'm not a survey researcher. But part of doing this kind of research is you learn as you go. And now all of a sudden, I'm feeling very comfortable when I'm like talking about quantitative methods and survey research because I've had to bang them against my head to try to make sense of this research and to make sure that it's actually quality research. Again, a benefit of working as a group because we do have quantitative researchers in the group who were able to guide me in the right direction, read the right stuff. Again, working as a group, totally encourage it. And then, of course, now we want to do some outreach work, of which I would count this as doing some outreach because we're showing you all what we found. We're working on some deliverables. They include, doing reports, policy briefs. They include writing some more grants. We are now compiling an online repository of sources on organizing. And we're going to do a town hall meeting in December for the American Geophysical Union, of which Marla will be participating. Thank you, Marla, and others. And we are going to be doing webinars, brown bag sessions, you name it. We're doing all kinds of outreach as needed in the midst of this pandemic. So what did we find? A lot of the things that we found confirmed what we observed in the previous annual surveys, but some things have changed. Over the years, we are noticing that climate change is becoming more and more important for engaged scientists from the Science Network, to the point where it's now the top issue, and it has been for the last 3 or 4 years, followed by the sidelining of science in policymaking. So folks are really, really worried about the extent to which science is used to enact policies. And they want to be more engaged around those kinds of issues. There are other issues like environmental justice that they're really interested in, working with the community, on having citizen and scientist collaborations, among other things. We find that we asked them, how are they involved? What kind of engagement are they involved in? We found that a lot of them, actually, the vast majority of them had either signed a petition and they had contacted an elected official and had donated to an NGO. These are the most common ways in which these folks have become politically involved. Another thing that we find is, again, not surprising, but you ask scientists, how did the current administration handle the pandemic? Terrible. I think more than 90% disapproved of the handling of the pandemic under the Trump administration. They are very worried about the White House's politicization of science, and that they consider that to be the most serious threat to science right now. It'll be interesting to see if this president loses his reelection bid, how much will that change moving forward? Are people still going to be worried about the politicization of science under a Biden presidency? We shall see. And that might have implications about the extent to which this population will want to remain involved in activism, because if they consider the biggest threat to science resolved by virtue of removing the current president, then maybe they're not interested in being active on other issues. We shall see, and we will survey them again in February to find out. When you ask them, what kind of guidance would you want in terms of the advocacy that you'd like to be involved in? They said they'd like more guidance on engaging with political officials. So these folks are really wanting to call elected representatives and let them know what they think and try to inject science into policymaking. This is also an interesting finding. When we ask them, how do they think that advocacy affect their careers? A lot of them, and most of them, said it actually helped their careers or it didn't hurt it. That's an important finding, because there is an existing conception of scientists as folks who are very weary of becoming involved in politics, right? Scientists are usually seen as objective observers who take no sides, who should never be involved in politics. And if they do become involved, they shall pay the professional price for doing so. Well, in a survey of a lot of folks who have just retired, had a successful career in academia, and are now retired, you ask them, did it affect your careers? Most of them said, actually, no. And actually, in some cases, it even helped it. So we're seeing changes in the ways in which scientists see themselves in relation to organizing and politics. But it's not just that. That's not the only thing that's happening. When you ask them, do you feel like your employer supports your activism? A lot of them said that they received some kind of support. Some of them said that they receive a lot of support for their involvement in political advocacy. That's a big difference. And in social science, particularly in sociology, one of the things that we like to observe when we try to understand activism is the extent to which there are contextual factors that might support mobilization. Your employer supporting you or having an organization that supports your activism is huge for driving mobilization. We've known this for a long time about mobilization generally, but now we're confirming this about mobilization of scientists specifically. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most scientists voted Democrat. In 2016 and in 2018, they had a lot of support for Hillary Clinton, and they were very involved in the midterms in 2018. But perhaps surprisingly, voter turnout amongst these scientists was extremely high, more than 90%. Why is that surprising? There's this notion that scientists don't vote. At least those who are engaged, they seem like they vote. So there needs to be more investigation, more research into that notion that scientists don't vote. It may be that STEM students don't vote. There is some evidence on that STEM students don't vote. But at the very least, once they become scientists, those who do, and if they're engaged, they vote. Again, this is an aging population, mostly white, mostly male. Very few are unemployed. And that seems to be, that's interesting for various reasons, and we can get more into this. One of the reasons for why this is interesting is that generally in social movement theory and research, folks have said that diversity in organizations is not a desirable trait because it leads to inefficiency. It's better when you have homogeneity because people don't fight against each other. You don't have these cleavages across different racial, gender, sexual identities, and so they flow better. Well, I've dedicated a lot of my time to try to counter that notion through empirical evidence. And I find that in many movements, it's actually helpful to have diversity, and that diversity could be a political resource. One of the reasons is that when you can make a claim of being an accurate representative of the people who you claim to represent, you have more legitimacy in the eyes of stakeholders and policymakers, because you say, no, I look like them. I am them. I should be able to represent them. So we're seeing that despite the fact that this is a predominantly white, older generation, male network, their organizers, their team leaders, the staff, they're mostly women of color and women, many of which are non-hetero. So this is pretty interesting in the sense that, contrary to existing notions of what would lead a movement to survive, to have coordination, to exert political influence, we're observing that actually diversity is working for this group. And they have grown tremendously since 2016. Of course, no coincidence, the Trump election pushed a lot of scientists into activism. Another interesting thing, and I will start winding down here, is that there's a good amount of folks who have said that they have experienced discrimination. And this is something that I tell my students who are aspiring scientists, and particularly political scientists. Look, it's not an easy career, and you're going to be surrounded by a lot of folks who don't necessarily look like you. You may very well experience discrimination. Look, a lot of different fields have skeletons in their closets, and a great mentor of mine once said it's about knowing where the skeletons are and which skeletons they have in their closet. I'm personally committed, personally and professionally committed to changing the demographics of the field of political science through various initiatives, as well as in science more generally. And this research that we're doing, we're hoping that sheds some light on how we can do so. In fact, I have an article coming out where I call for an organizing approach to diversifying political science. It should be out next week, actually, so I'm excited to share it with you all. If you follow the journal PS, Political Science and Politics, you'll be able to see them put it on their social media. And I know this because they just asked me to write my own tweet that they will tweet about my article. So now you know who wrote it. But anyways, I'm calling for an organizing approach, but because look, things don't change through magic. Like, the people who are in power don't just magically wake up one day and decide, oh, you know what, political science would be so much nicer if it was more diverse. Things just don't work like that. They're going to wake up and they're going to continue to do the work that they want to do and that advances their careers if we don't make them change it. So that's why I'm calling for an organizing approach. And that is why we need to invest so much in telling people, look, if you become active in politics, even though you are a scientist, it won't necessarily hurt your career. It might help it. And there are ways in which you can affect change, in which we could address some of the things that you're most concerned about. Climate change. We can address environmental justice issues. We can address the use of science in policy, if and only if we mobilize our peers, our students, to become involved in these issues. But there are things that will be obstacles, including the experiences of discrimination. So that's why a lot of us will have to take care of each other. We'll have to support each other. And that's why mentorship matters so much. Last thing I will say is that we are pretty excited because not only do we have really interesting results at the sort of macro bird's eye view level of what this network looks like, but at the end of the survey, we asked them two things. First, do you want a calendar? And a lot of them said yes. We ended up having to send a lot of calendars. Thankfully, we have staff in this organization to handle that. I didn't have to send calendars myself. That would have been a very time-consuming process. Some folks were like out of the country and they wanted calendars. That was another challenge that I was fortunate not to have to deal with. But the other thing we asked them was, are they willing to be contacted for an interview? So we're really excited about the prospect of learning so much more about these folks, about the activism that they've engaged in, the challenges that they faced through in-depth interviewing, which of course will do things for us, will capture nuances of their political participation and their opinions that would be impossible to capture through other methods, particularly through this method of survey research. So we're also excited to compare this population to the average American citizen. Generally, they're more active than the average American citizen politically. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to consider science to be a threat. So anyways, we can talk more about how they compare to the average citizen, how they compare to those who became part of the resistance. Also very interesting. There was a March of Science that was part of the so-called resistance. So we're doing all these comparisons as well. And we have all kinds of research that we want to do moving forward. I can go into how we're going to make sure this research gets adapted. But first, I want to open it up for your questions and just start a conversation around anything that might have been interesting to you throughout this presentation. All right.
I had a question. If you could go back to like the last slide.
Yes.
Yeah, so it says 50% of those that you surveyed were retired. And I feel like generally that is going to be the male and white demographic. And more of the emerging professional scientists are going to be of more diverse backgrounds. And so I guess I'm wondering if half of them are retired, like is the Union of Concerned Scientists trying to survey more emerging scientists to try to get that more diverse response rate?
Absolutely. So we're doing a few things. One of which will be that we know from the membership records what the demographic looks like. So we're going to be able to adopt survey weights, and these numbers might change. It may end up being that a lot less of them are retired. But you are right. The Union of Concerned Scientists is incredibly invested right now, in part because of what happened this summer with Black Lives Matter, in becoming a more anti-racist organization. And they face internal turmoil for that. They have had to have their own reckoning. In fact, it's been a process, and I've been observing it from the inside, and I'm still like trying to digest everything. But the president was asked to step down by staff, and he accepted, he resigned, and the board accepted his resignation. He's going to stay until the end of the year, and at which point we will be having a new president, and it's very likely that this will not be a white male president. And this change will, there are demands for this change to trickle down all the way to from the bottom to the top, and from the top to the bottom. We will be seeing some major changes within this organization, which include changing the agenda of the organization in ways that actually show and demonstrate its commitment to being an anti-racist organization. So there will be more investments in trying to organize more early career scientists of color, women scientists. In fact, some of my colleagues there are on the board of 500 Women Scientists, another really important organization of scientists. And yes, we do want to oversample early career scientists of color and women scientists and try to understand what specifically about them drives them to organize and drives their political opinions. We will be able to do some of that with this existing survey because we will be able to cross-tabulate out of those who are early career scientists. How do they feel about each of these things? We already know a little bit. Early career scientists, scientists of color are more likely to report experiences of discrimination in the workplace. So that's in itself something to be, very concerned about. They are also likely to be more involved in political advocacy. So they're even more invested. And it's interesting to see that as science becomes more diversified, we also see more investment in advocacy. And we also see a larger share of network members interested in questions of justice, of environmental justice, of racial justice. So I think that will change the agenda of the organization and the ways the organization interacts with other organizations, which includes organizations that are predominantly led by women and people of color, like Ciencia Puerto Rico, which is working out of Puerto Rico, or environmental justice organizations like the Climate Justice Alliance, the Building Equity for Impact Initiative, a fantastic, interesting initiative that I've written about in my work on climate justice with a good colleague of mine, Gustavo Garcia Lopez. So I think that, yes, we as a working group and the organization itself is also, we're all interested in digging deeper into understanding, but also using the evidence to diversify advocacy and strengthen it. And to support their careers, of course, because, you know, it's hard to become politically involved if you can't actually have a career in this field.
This is kind of connected to Rachel's question, but I was wondering, in the like 400 plus people who agreed to be interviewed, if there like was a differential between like them being like these white, you know, older male retired scientists. Because I know a lot of times, you know, if you are being discriminated against in the workplace, you can be like less likely to want to speak out because of fear of like retribution from your employer. But I was just, yeah, wondering if there was any like gender, like race spread in those responses.
We do see that scientists of color are more likely to, and women are more likely to report experiences of discrimination, but it doesn't seem like that has stopped them from being politically active in any case. And this we need to do more research on. These folks are more involved. And here I'm speculating. Why would that be? It may be that, you know, they have taken very seriously the notion that, you know, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? Right? They've realized, like, only the people save the people, right? And they've realized, look, they're not going to do it for us, so we're going to have to become involved and do it for ourselves. In that sense, I would recommend the fantastic work of a colleague of mine, Nadia Brown, who has written about this notion that, you know, women of color have to do it for themselves. She calls it sisters doing it for themselves. Fantastic piece on Black Lives Matter activism that I think is applicable to other areas of research. It's a co-authored book chapter with Jean Beeman, Sisters Doing It for Themselves.
Interesting. Have you found differences between the type of university or organization that they are subscribed to?
That's a good question. One thing we realize is that there's not really enough there to make good claims about that, because the vast majority of them are involved, are affiliated to research intensive institution. Mm-hmm. So I think future research will have to dig deeper into that and to oversample those who are not in these research intensive institution. Another thing about type of institution, there's this understanding that engaged scientists and those who are affiliated with Union of Concerned Scientists are generally coastal elites. You know, we're about to geolocate all of these folks because we have their zip codes. Mm-hmm. It's amazing what data can do. We're actually doing that this week and next week. But generally, just looking at the data without visualizing it yet, there's also a lot of scientists in the Midwest. They're not just coastal elites. You also have a lot of scientists in college towns that are in the middle of relatively low population areas. So there's still, of course, huge clusters in the Northeast, you know, huge clusters in the East Coast, huge clusters of organizers in the West Coast, but it's not like the middle of the country is just void of science activism. No, there's particularly in the Midwest and in the Southwest, you have science advocacy, which, you know, in a sense should come as no surprise because there are a lot of big universities, the Big Ten, you know, and other smaller universities there as well, and private schools, things of that nature. Other questions?
I have one more question.
Oh, we have a question on the chat as well. Charlie, my internet connection isn't stable, so I'm asking to the chat. That's definitely okay. In your experience with organizing, how do organizations prioritize marginalized voices without overburdening marginalized people? Really good question. I did this in my dissertation, actually, and in other case studies. But one thing that I noticed in my dissertation is that, you know, there's this huge debate about whether diversity is good or bad for organizations. I had read some work that had argued that it was good, and I was coming from that tradition. I had my personal opinion about it. I think diversity is good. I mean, I'm invested in it. But there's a huge set of folks who say no, it leads to inefficiencies, it's more costly, things of that nature. Well, a sociologist had published this fantastic piece. I believe it was in the American Sociological Review. Cedric Herring, who titled it "Diversity Pays." I think that was the title, "Diversity Pays." And one thing he finds is that more diverse for-profit firms are more profitable. And I said, okay, so we know from the work of Iris Marion Young that diversity can be used as a political resource. We know from the work of folks like Margaret Keck and Catherine Sickink that diversity in transnational organizing could lend the organizers legitimacy. We know from the work of Scott Page in Michigan, who says that diversity can make institutions like higher education institutions or even primary and secondary institutions, more diverse institutions, more innovative. So there are all these benefits. I said, you know what, let's study this within movements. Well, one thing that I find is that diversity is not necessarily profitable in these organizations. In fact, in order for diversity to flourish, organizations need to have some money. Why? Because of one of the things that you're asking is, how do you avoid overburdening marginalized people? You got to throw money at it. You got to give them good jobs. You got to give them good health care. You got to pay their time off. You got to have multiple people. You can't just hire one person of color and say, here, person of color, deal with all of the issues of people of color and represent all of the opinions of most of the world's population within this predominantly white organization. You can't do that without overburdening them. How do you do that? How do you get to a point where you build enough support for the leadership of marginalized groups? I've made an argument for an intersectional solidarity approach. What that means is supporting the leadership of marginalized folks, supporting their autonomous organizing. So if they want to have a caucus, if they want to have their own organization within the broad organization, support that process, because democratic theorists have argued that in those autonomous spaces is where these folks articulate their own perspective. They build their own power, which they then take to the broader organization, and that is a good thing. And lastly, and third, avoiding the practice of suppressing difference, suppressing dissent. A lot of organizations, when they have internal differences, they always feel tempted to suppress it, to say, no, we don't have no issues here. We are A-okay. We're one. Some have argued, no, it's better to portray yourself as a unit that is united in diversity, that seeks consensus, all the while avoiding the practice of suppressing dissent. When organizations do this, I've been finding that they're more likely to survive, they're more politically influential, and I've seen this in various organizations. Transnational was my dissertation, but I've also seen it in more local organizing, like some of my work in on the feminist movement and the student movement in Puerto Rico. Thank you for that question, Charlie, and I'm hoping that was a good response to it. But if you have follow-up questions, feel free to post them on the chat. Also, I have good news to share. It looks like the Washington Post wants the piece.
Yay!
Yeah. So now I have to find time to write it, and I'm not going to tell my girlfriend that I said yes to this because she'll be very mad. I'm supposed to seal our roof this week.
I have a question. I feel like sometimes there's this idea that like the university and institutions of higher education is kind of like incompatible with like activism or organizing just because of the like positionality of universities within society, and like it's hard to engage in like meaningful organizing because of the like privilege of these like higher institutions. So I was just wondering if like that's something that you've thought about or like have run into. I know it's kind of a more general question, but like I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question? I didn't follow very well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. I was just wondering if you have thoughts on the idea of like, because of the position of the university in society, having like a lot of privilege and being like in a really high up place, how it can be hard for people within that to engage in like meaningful organizing and activism because you're working within this system, I guess. I don't know, it's kind of a complicated
No,
question.
that's a great question, you know, and I've been involved in this other more radical group. It's called the Scholars for Social Justice. And, you know, I find it fascinating because they're not drinking the Kool-Aid that like the university is going to save us. You know, they're like, you want to organize? You need to step out of the ivory tower. You need to like actually, you know, step out and put your feet on the ground and like join people on the ground. So they're like, not only do we need to organize to change this system of higher education, we also need to take what we do within this system outside of it and bring what is outside of it into it. That means, you know, for someone like me, when I go and speak with organizers, I'm not trying to only extract the answers that I'm looking for. No, because these folks, through their experiences, have been able to generate knowledge, and they themselves have their own analysis, and they deserve recognition for that. So we need to be able to recognize their co-authorship as co-creators of this knowledge. And I think that we need to break with this tradition of looking at the university as the sole provider of knowledge, and instead really adopt a notion of knowledge as something that is created within and outside of it. And that's a good thing, right? So yes, I think the university often places a lot of obstacles and constraints on our organizing. I also think that it provides and may provide important resources for organizing. Like for instance, cooperation, interaction. So from literature on cooperation and collaboration, we know that interaction matters for solidarity, right? So for instance, there's this fantastic book that is called Cultures of Solidarity by Rick Fantasia. And what he argues is that one of the reasons for why workers in factory floors are able to engage in high-risk activism like striking, even though they might lose their jobs or there might be bodily injury against them, is because they have had interactions over extended periods of time. And throughout those interactions, they begin to develop a sense of collective, a sense of solidarity. And this is powerful. These folks feel like they should protect each other, like they should fight for each other's rights. I think the university allows many of us to meet. How would we be communicated right now if it weren't for the institution of higher education? We probably wouldn't ever meet each other. So it is an important meeting place, I think. And if we know how to seize those opportunities of organizing, I think we could really exploit the opportunities that exist within it.
Yeah, just to comment on that, I think you'll be like, you know, fascinated to know that I think McAllister really embodies your institution's like goal, I guess, because our environmental studies major is very interdisciplinary, and like even looking at it first, I was concerned being forced to take classes outside of just science. I was like, oh no, I have to take a politics class and the classics English class. But I think that is leading to the kind of well-rounded scientists that you want in your organization that we need in this world. And like it's creating more like concerned scientists basically, or empathetic people. So yeah, I think that's the good answer to your question too. Like I think McAllister itself they have a lot of work to do, obviously, but they're doing a good job already with us as students. So
I'm really happy to hear that, and I'm really excited for you all to be at a place that has that as part of its mission. And I think more and more we are noticing that universities are becoming they're warming up to this kind of way of doing science, of doing education. And I know that, for instance, my university is feeling that way as well, and they are now very excited about the fact that they are well ranked in the U.S. News and World Report ranking on community engaged universities. So now this is a thing that places aspire to. I think that there's a lot of potential for universities doing that. And let's not forget that the largest development in the field of higher education came as a result of a law that was meant to promote the creation of universities, what are now known as the land-grant universities, that would serve the public. That is the sole mission of these universities, to serve the public. It was to train the future workforce. It was to help with agricultural and industrial development. It was to help address social issues. We should never lose sight of these institutions' reasons of being.
Mm-hmm. We still have about 5 minutes. Does anyone have any other question or comment?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had discussions in other classes about like scientific jargon and language and how that can impede accessibility. And I guess I'm wondering if the topic of language ever came up in like your research and surveys, particularly because these are scientists who want to like participate in advocacy and politics and whatnot.
Absolutely, absolutely. The motto of the Scholar Strategy Network, where I worked before, was no jargon. That was their motto. And they have a podcast called No Jargon. And the rule of this podcast, the one rule, is you cannot use jargon when you explain your research. For those of us who are not used to that, it can be challenging. But it's something that we cannot lose sight of. It's an aspiration that, in fact, should not even be an aspiration. It should be a norm. I mean, what is the point of generating knowledge if it is not intelligible to those who are affected by its use, right? I don't think that we should follow these Enlightenment ideals of generating knowledge for the sake of knowledge. No, I think that we should have purposeful and intentional aims when we develop knowledge. So avoiding jargon is one way in which we achieve those aims, right? And coming back to the political theory sort of aspect of my training, you know, I'm fascinated by the work of the Italian political theorist and Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And one of the reasons that I'm fascinated by his work is because he in his writing was very, by the way, he wrote most of this work from prison. No laptop, no nothing, prison, where he died. He was a prisoner of the fascist regime of Mussolini. And one of the things that he wrote about was that, you know, there's a difference between traditional intellectuals and organic intellectuals. And he said organic intellectuals are the most important because they are the ones who render our world intelligible for those who can do something with that knowledge. It is the person in the factory floor who goes and speaks to their coworkers and said, you know what? This is what's happening. This is what the employer is doing to us, and this is what we can do. This is what the law says we can do. This is what the law should say. That's why we should become involved in policy making. That intellectual, Gramsci argued, is the most important. And Gramsci argued that these intellectuals are not necessarily associated to these traditional academic institutions. They are your, you know, your working class folks who are interested and able to render our world more intelligible for their colleagues and peers. He also said that the only way in which we disrupt dominant ways of looking at the world, dominant worldviews, is through counter-hegemonic struggles. And that for that, we needed to use popular culture. And that's why there's so much value in memes or in short videos or in music or in film. Just to think about, I don't know if you all saw, the other day, Taylor Swift allowed for her music to be used for the first time for a political ad. And I had all these colleagues crying in front of their computers because they heard this Taylor Swift song that was like produced in a way that really elicited those emotions. That right there, I think, is the kind of intellectualism and the kind of messaging that we should be aspiring to, even though I will admit I know no Taylor Swift songs, but I see the value in her work.
Any other question?
I told you I would bring some hope into your morning. I'm hoping you all feeling a little refreshed. There's a lot of good work to do out there. And Amala, please feel free to share my contact info. I'll actually put it in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me and ask any questions or, follow up. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well,
no, thank you.
I think I speak for all of them that your presentation was awesome. You are an awesome person. And we are very lucky to have you with us here today.
I'm very fortunate as well. I mean, I needed someone and folks to, I guess, unwind after what's going on. But it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Bergen, do you want to finish with something in particular?
I don't have anything particularly. No, I kind of asked my question, but yeah, thank you so much. I think, like Marla said, behalf on all of us, that was really interesting and definitely makes me feel more hopeful as we enter what is likely to be a tumultuous second day of the election. So yeah, thank you.
No, thank you all, and stay strong. We're all in this together.
Yes. Okay, let's give him a round of applause. I like these ones better than the
I haven't figured out how to change their colors. I have to figure that out.
All righty. Well, everyone, take care. Thank you again. And I'm sure you will hear from some of them very soon.
All right. I would look forward to that. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.